Welcome here with me, Cedar Varn, at Radical Engagement here at Varn Blog. Man, that's a lot of my last name. Um, for those of you who know a lot about me, you may know that I am a public school teacher, and I've been a private school teacher and a charter school teacher, and a teacher of teachers. For the last about 19 years of my life, 17 years in public education, and off and on, in secondary education for 17 years, and public education for more than half of that. I have a lot of ties to the educational system, and I've been a critic of it. A long time ago, when I left teaching public school during the Great Recession in 2009 to 2010, I went to go teach teachers, but I also got into a PhD program for pedagogical research and ended up losing funding, not even because of my grades, because funding just got shifted around. And in response to Great Recessionary stuff, and I went off and went and taught teachers in South Korea. So I've been thinking about education as my primary thing for almost 20 years. And there are many times where I thought about leaving it entirely. And I've noted that in most states, since about 2010, most teachers, even though in most states it requires specialized degrees and whatnot to do, don't stay in the profession for more than 5 years. In fact, about 50% leave. And we've been about 25% understaffed for over a decade. Now, we lost about 25% of the staff during the Great Recession when I left public school teaching in the first place, but we've never gotten it back. Teachers programs have trouble attracting people, and now the states are beginning to do things like finally pay people for doing their student teaching, which used to be something you paid to do. And it's still not really saving the profession. And that's after the red state revolts in the mid-aught teens, where the teachers unions and teachers associations really pushed for better pay in a lot of the upper South and Midwest, after teachers unions really hit in the upper Midwest in the beginning of the aught teens. I've followed this religiously. Another thing that I can say is that I've been in a teachers union for now 5 years. I've been a rep for 4 of them. I could go into all kinds of problems and benefits of the teachers unions, but they're different from place to place. Which brings me to today's article by Stephen Adubato. I'm sorry, Dr. Adubato, fucking up your name. Anyway, so who is this guy? And this is an article from Compact Magazine. And before people come at me, I'm not reading it because of the ideological orientation of Compact Magazine, which frankly is a little bit all over the place. I'm reading it because it's a good article. And because I agree with a lot of it. And because I don't think I've heard realistic answers from either reformists or revolutionaries for how to deal with general education in a long time. Now, I've spent a lot of my time studying Bakhtin and Vygotsky and Medvedev and a lot of the Russian pedagogical and linguistic anthropological thinkers, and I've tried to incorporate that into what I know from pedagogy. And I have also decided that my view of education, while broadly aimed at an egalitarian vision, is not the same as progressive constructivism as understood by John Dewey and the dominant model of American education among the progressive movement, until basically we just give up having standards altogether. Now, you might go, Varn, are you really saying that teachers and stuff don't have standards? Well, teachers do, but they're in a system that is incentivized not to. And I've talked about this many, many times. We're at an 87% rough graduation rate for the country, but literacy has declined. More and more states are just getting rid of test scores, which, while they are racially and ethnically and economically biased, are less racially, ethnically, and economically biased than grades. Grades have way more implicit bias in them, and it stands to reason. But also, despite the focus on this, and despite even ending a lot of the charter school pressures and the NCLB pressures, which I have seen some people try to bring back since school standards have just fallen off a cliff since 2015, the issue is that a lot of the real gains in literacy were done at a state by state level in the 90s. And that NCLB didn't really help that a lot. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, NCLB is a law that was the law of the land until 2015 and was reconfigured at the end of 2015. And it was really put on pause in the first Obama administration, that required a certain amount of growth for all demographic groups based on test scores alone, which led to test score driven education, which made school a whole lot less fun. Now, there were reforms on test and stuff in the 90s that were pretty strict, but were not as geared to like cutting music and cutting art. But to hear things today, you either go back to the NCLB regime or you accept today's standards of pretty much nothing. Because the only thing we're really judging schools on is graduation rates. All right. But let's get into this Behind the Teacher Exodus from Compact Mag from December 30th, 2024 by Stephen G. Adubato. Stephen G. Adubato is a writer, reporter, and professor of philosophy. I believe he's in New York. Growing up, Michaela de Simone was one of those cliche children who always knew she wanted to teach. There's not many of those cliche children anymore, by the way. I don't meet students who really want to teach. Seriously, I don't. It is incredibly rare. With a father, two grandmothers, and several aunts and uncles in the field, the New York native decided to pursue a degree in education and become a teacher in Queens. She didn't foresee that she would leave behind what she had thought of as her calling in June 2023 at the age of 30, after less than a decade in the classroom. Well, that's pretty common. It's actually a surprise she made it that long. De Simone felt demoralized, she told me, by the low pay, the demands of learning how to teach virtually during the pandemic, which they like. I am a specialist at it, and most people were just told to do it with no help. I was actually transitioning online during the pandemic, and I became an online content writer because of that. But it's because I've been doing this podcast stuff for years and actually have a good grasp of what online teaching can't easily do. Now I could go into that, but I'm not going to, because there's a lot more here. The lack of resources and support offered to teachers and students alike. Now, we've heard this story since I've heard this story my whole life, although a lot more people used to want to teach. De Simone is one of many K-12 teachers who are leaving the profession behind. In October 2023, 86% of schools belonging to the National Education Association indicated that they were seeing more educators leave the profession since the start of the pandemic. It took a little while for that to kick in. This is where I'm talking. Utah, for example, didn't start losing educators after the pandemic for about 2 years. Probably because a lot of people were afraid there weren't other jobs out there. But now people are leaving. Some people are leaving because of the cost of childcare. It's a primary female field. Some people are leaving because they're tired of the treatment. Some people are leaving because they feel like admin doesn't do anything. Numerous school districts, especially in lower income neighborhoods, are faced with a teacher shortages. Utah's had a teacher shortage for a decade. Many of these former teachers, like De Simone, are heartbroken, even bitter, about what they once thought of as their dream jobs. It was never my dream job. I ended up being a teacher by accident, so maybe that's part of why I still do it. Some have even taken the YouTube and social media to tell their why I quit teaching stories. Okay, again, not new, but it is increasing. Do we trust the anecdotes? Well, it's matched by data. The stories conveyed in this viral trend are matched to data. Those who leave teaching behind cite low pay. Since 1996, the average wage of public school teachers has risen just 29 has risen just $29, 416 less than the average wage increase earned by other college graduates. Unmanageable class sizes, which have only gotten bigger. I teach classes of 40, and I did in person too. And if we actually enforce the truancy laws in my state, which we don't have anymore, we used to have them, I wouldn't have enough space in my classroom. But since we don't really enforce them, it's not a huge deal. There are ways to try to mitigate these truancy rules, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Lack of support from both administrators and parents. Yep. And disrespect from students. I don't get a lot of disrespect from students, but I see how it could happen. Oh, and we mentioned Christopher Lasch, a guy I've spent 6 years reading everything by. It is 1976 book, Culture of Narcissism. Lasch warned that the bureaucratization of education would erode the legitimacy of adults' authority over children, provoking them in a boundless rage against those who failed to gratify them. Yeah. Stories told by former teachers of students spitting, cursing, and hurling deaths at teachers, and those of administrators who caved to parents demanding that the teacher, rather than the student, be penalized, suggest Lasch's warning was pathetic. And I've seen that. I've definitely seen people go after the teacher for student behavior. Some of the times it is because the teacher is boring, etc., etc. But not all the time. I mean, it's even happened to me once in my 19-year career. Individual teachers, school boards, and think tanks are attempting to find a way to improve teachers' working conditions so to combat the burnout, proposing a variety of measures ranging from increasing pay to benefits, offering coverage for mental health care. Yeah, they finally started offering coverage for mental health in my district, but it's actually making insurance costs go up dramatically because there's so much use of it. But such measures fail to address a deeper problem, a bloated bureaucracy that has swallowed up education and now makes it nearly impossible for teachers to do their job. And this is true. I've been talking about this for years. The cost of educating a student on average has doubled in the last 20 years. 92 to 93% of all money spent in education goes to staffing, and yet teacher pay as a percentage of the budget has stagnated or decreased relative to inflation. Well, where's that money going? It's going to ever more district level admin consultants. And there's more and more of them. Teaching, noted De Simone, demands a graduate degree, with depends on the state, but in a lot of schools. And yet we treat teachers like they barely graduated from middle school. Yet that also is true. I remember getting talked to by some administrators as I was a kid. My current administrator doesn't do that. Thank you. I'm not just saying that because he's my current administrator. It's part of why I stay where I'm at. But, and I'm not going to tell you where that is. But still, I've definitely been there. Administrators too often act like managers whose job it is to keep their customers, students, and their parents happy, and regard teachers as mere service workers. I mean, we shouldn't insert service workers. But yeah, they're afraid of making parents mad because parents will go to school boards and the school boards will want to appease the loudest people in the room. And since there's no other forces holding school boards accountable in a lot of cases, because school board elections are often not very highly voted in, that's what you get. The endless bureaucratic tasks teachers are expected to undertake for the sake of accountability distracts from the real demands of education. The paperwork load has increased dramatically in the past 20 years. I used to keep 2 grade books and, all that myself when I first started teaching in the mid-aughts. Today, I have to keep 2 different logs, multiple grade books. I know what my students are doing by the second because it's all online. And I have to make so many contacts a week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Jared Zigalis, a former high school teacher in Omaha, Nebraska, took on moderating the school newspaper. But after a parent complained about an article that was published, the administration shut down the whole production. That happens a lot. Upon asking why they couldn't just have dealt with the article in question, Zigalis was told by his assistant principal that his number one priority was to protect the brand of the school. But by that, which they actually mean there is not get sued. Zigalis has also found himself alarmed at how students have become openly defiant post-pandemic. They seem to assume that they would face no consequences from administration because they don't. And they were sometimes correct. He recalled confronting a student who was yelling cuss words across the parking lot at a girl, and the student then went off on him in front of parents, students, and security guards who proceeded to do nothing. He spoke with administrators about the incident, but the same student came up to him the next day and laughed about the fact the administration had done nothing. Zigalis said he could take it, but he could only imagine how such behavior would have impacted a younger teacher, especially a female one. And yes, it's something I noticed. And remember, the profession is predominantly female. Indeed, some women who have quit teaching report violent and sometimes sexualized behavior directed against them by students amongst the reasons why they left the profession. I don't see as much of that out here in Utah, but I know it happens. Two women who I knew who taught at the same high school told me that two separate incidents, both of which occurred during the first month back in the classroom after the pandemic, in which male students had unzipped their pants in front of them. Both students were given a slap on the wrist. A teacher in her 50s, I will call Mary, told me a student threw a stapler at her head for telling him to wait until she finished explaining directions to assignment to use the bathroom. Although she reported him to the dean of students, the student was sitting in my class the next day with a smirk on his face. Fearing for her safety, she quit a few weeks later. Perhaps even worse was the apathy engineered by bureaucratic organizational models that are the new therapeutic discipline programs based on restorative justice implemented in some schools. Now, I'm going to defend restorative justice in abstract because if you actually do restorative justice right, it's pretty brutal. If you have to fix what you did, that's what restorative justice offers, then you actually have to enforce a lot of stuff. The problem is that requires an administration to put a lot of time into making students fix what they did, not just repair the relationship by saying sorry, but that's what it often ends up being. So restorative justice often ends up being not a whole lot, and it takes disciplining kids off the administrative task because the administrators increasingly have more and more reports to do for more and more different over administrators in the school bureaucracy and more demands from the federal government to document everything. Among the most popular restorative justice programs is the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, or PBIS, which was first introduced in the early 2000s and spread widely in American schools in the late 2010s. Yeah, I've been trained on this. We don't use it, though, but I've been trained on it. Some districts report positive experience with the programs focusing on supportive rather than punitive approaches to disruptive behavior. Others have found it exacerbates already existing problems. It depends on how it's implemented, and it takes a lot to implement, and that's the problem with a lot of these more therapeutic models. Now, the other thing is, restorative justice and therapeutic modeling aren't exactly the same thing, but they end up being understood by administrators as being the same thing. Trish Hepzibah, an ex-teacher in the Midwest with a popular YouTube channel, explains that she left the classroom behind in part because of the Pollyannaish New Age discipline method practiced by her former employer, which upheld the belief that punitive measures were bad and instead relied on rewarding or merely good or merely normal behavior by, for instance, giving students candy for being quiet during a lesson, something that we were told not to do for years and then it's come back. In her book, Bad Therapy, Why Kids Aren't Growing Up, Abigail Shearer, not a person I love, by the way, but nonetheless, features stories of several teachers who told her that thanks to restorative justice, public schools no longer hold back or expel kids, but in the most extreme circumstances, until they commit egregious acts of criminality, violent kids are kept in school and assigned to shadows on the therapeutic ethos, treat but don't punish. Actually, since we've gotten rid of alternative schools and in-school suspension because they're expensive, all right, that's why we did it. And yes, they also led to the school to prison pipeline, and a lot of that shit was terrible. But we don't have those options anymore. So if you get a safe school violation in Utah, for example, you just get moved to a different school program. Now, I think a lot of stuff doesn't need to be punished, but violent behavior, you gotta have to smack down. Um, like whenever a student was in trouble, Hepzibah recalls, administrators would ask her what she had done to anger the student. Yeah, I've been asked that. Programs like PBS, she said, promote the idea that students should never feel embarrassed or any sort of shame about any kind of behavior. Now, I'm actually going to say embarrassing students is a way to lose them. Uh, Old school teachers know that. But shame because of the violation of relationality, which implies that a relationship is there, is actually kind of useful. Now, one thing you do, and I will say this, is you don't publicly shame students in front of their peers, but that tends to get violent responses, particularly in teenagers. But again, one such program dictated that when correcting a student, one should constantly remind them over and over again, I'm not mad and you're not in trouble, even when she was having objects thrown at her. Yeah, well, a lot of this is because administrators don't know how to or don't believe in contextualizing anything. But anyway, so they'll read this and tell you to say that in every situation, which is I just don't. Um, while the proliferation of online testimonies has brought attention to the failures of American schools, even though we've been talking about it literally for 20 to 30 years, that's me talking. And I get gaslit by liberals about this all the damn time, despite the fact that literacy programs are bad. Although I'm going to actually add this. As students get out of this situation and they move into their working lives, they actually get less literate, not more. Which means the lower that these students start off as a baseline, the worse it's going to get. Maybe. I'm not actually sure that's a total justification, but we'll get there. When I asked if I consider staying in the game and trying to use the teachers union to push for reforms, I was given mixed responses. Yeah, the teachers union is sometimes very useful if you have big community buy-in into the union, but if you don't, it's a lot harder to use. So Giles only joined the union during her last year as a teacher and was disappointed by his experience. When dealing with the difficult situation with administration, he told me his union rep said the admins were too smart to do anything that we can get them in trouble for, and he advised him to get a doctor's note and take leave for the rest of the year. Wow. Nicholas Ferrone, a teacher in Union, New Jersey, was a bit more optimistic. He doesn't judge teachers who quit, nor is he naive about the difficulties they face, but he opted to stay and make a difference from within. Ferrone doesn't agree with everything the unions do, but says, I can't even comprehend what the pay would be if we didn't have them to fight for us. Well, I can tell you, I lived in a non-union state and it was bad, but I've lived in union states where it's also bad. It depends on the union in your state and what their relationship is to local officials and how militant they're willing to be and how NGO focused they are. And it's also going to depend on the charter of the union. And even if you're in the American Federation of Teachers or the National Educators Association, either one of them are going to have different rules depending, and it's going to depend on whether or not you can strike in that state. So in Utah, there are student associations, and you can't strike, but you can collective bargain, and you can do you can do work actions. In Georgia, there was no collective bargaining, but we didn't get that much worse of a contract than teachers here. So in Utah. So I don't know. Make of that what you will. Unions are not the only means for collective actions. Parents, too, play a positive role, as Ferrone told me. If I was a parent and I knew my child's teacher was working a second or third job to survive, and that they were begging for supplies on lines, and that they were having mental breakdowns because they had so many kids packed in the classroom, I would be flipping out at board meetings and getting every parent I knew to do the same. Yeah, but they don't. Most of the parents are actually more concerned about censoring books. Upon instituting the common schools movement in the 1830s, the educational reformer Horace Mann aspired to shift control over education into the hands of state-run professional bureaucracies. His motives were ostensibly egalitarian. All children, whether elite or working class, native-born or immigrants, received the same opportunities. Yet Mann also hoped to counteract the backwards influence of provincial and immigrant families. As Lash put it, I love Lash, but Lash is not the greatest person to get all your educational history from. As a person who's read a ton of educational history and read a ton of Lash, as Lash put it, he wanted children to receive their impression from the world from those who were professionally qualified to decide what was proper for them to know. That was part of the progressive movement, by the way, and part of liberal thinking going all the way back to the Enlightenment. Remember, there was the democratic form of the Enlightenment. There was the enlightened despot form of the Enlightenment, because they didn't believe that people would be educated enough to be able to be enlightened citizens until a despot made it so. That was Voltaire's position, for example. Further, Mann's educational approach was less focused on actual forms of academic learning, like in calculating wisdom or teaching practical skills, all of which lasting conducive to forming responsible, self-reliant citizens, than on social control. I think that's actually fair about Horace Mann. Horace Mann is not the only source of our modern schooling, though. We also get a whole lot from the Prussian schooling movement, which was even more about social control, and we get a lot from Dewey and constructivism. By design, the school's appropriation of many of the training functions formerly carried out by the family made it more difficult for parents to raise their children according to their own principles, but also made it more difficult for teachers, pressure to take on the role of parent, psychologist, and social worker to teach. This is actually more and more true. Teachers are used as, I mean, we're even beginning to be used as like guards. The professionalization of teaching, says Lash, rather than raising academic standards or improving the quality of teaching, is undermining the teacher's autonomy, substituting judgment of administrators for that of the teacher, and incidentally discouraging people with a gift for teaching from entering the profession at all. And he was saying that in the 60s and the 70s, guys. And by the way, Lash actually documents that a lot of the fights that we had in the 80s, 90s, and aughts when I was in school or when I began teaching. I had careers other than teaching. For those of you who don't know, I didn't start teaching until I was 27. Nonetheless, I think it's interesting that we don't look at this rather holistically. Now, I don't know what Lash, I think Lash is maybe over idealizing family education for a variety of reasons, because frankly, it doesn't really work in a capitalist economy. And socialist economies have not really gone that way either. In so much as socialist economies have existed. All right. But nonetheless, you are where you are. Lash also highlighted connections between moral and economic factors. He was quick to censor neoconservatives who decried the ways the highly bureaucratic public schools overstep the rights of parents, while also working to reserve New Deal policies that guarantee working families adequate compensation, without which it would be increasingly difficult to find the time to be present in their kids' lives. And they're just not today. They don't have time for that. That's why there's such a fight over values in public school, because frankly, students spend more time with teachers than they probably do their parents in a lot of cases. The social atomization, collapse of stable jobs in favor of gig work, and the increased automation and bureaucratization brought on by the pandemic, which was already beginning way before the pandemic, but I agree that it was exacerbated by the pandemic, exacerbated many of the problems that plague American primary and secondary schools. But Lash telling the story of American mass education shows that a few of these problems are truly novel, even if they have taken on new forms. In the past, critics from both the left and the right argued that over-bureaucratization of schools and disempower parents and students alike. Today, we find the concern shifted towards a way it affords parents and students too much power while depriving teachers of autonomy. Yet this power is essentially empty, an illusionary power of the consumer. Bingo! Because the kids, the parents aren't actually able to really help their kids. That's why a lot of them can't read. The collapse of general authority makes the weight of centralized bureaucracies and therapeutic consumerist mentality has created a system over which all parties feel they lack any meaningful control. Yep. Even the administrators don't feel like they have any meaningful control. I've talked to plenty. They don't feel like they have it either. They feel like they have 1,000 contradictory stakeholders, because they do. An effective reform in the structure and culture of school would be linked to labor and economic policy reforms that would protect the rights of working families, thus make it easier to be present in their children's lives, And on the other, protect teachers, assuring adequate compensation, benefits, free supplies, and reasonable classroom sizes. But the exodus of teachers suggests the time has come to reevaluate the project of universal education, starting by coming to terms with the fact that schools, as Lash says, cannot save society. Well, they're being asked to do too much. We can't educate society, though, but we're being asked to do things more than that. Education was never going to save everything. It's essential, but not sufficient, and not even probably the most important thing. Every educational meta study I know actually talks about, yes, teachers can have an effect on margin. School systems can have an effect on margin, but it's on margin. Larger social trends actually dominate. Or as Adorno liked to say, a wrong life can't be lived rightly. Now, I know that this may be a way to argue that for things like privatized private schools should really function. Private schools are affected by their selectivity. Making them mass would undo that. So why the hell would they agree to it? So yeah, you can throw money at people, but that's not going to work. You're going to see that with charter schools, which unfortunately tend to drain money out of public coffers because they're public-private partnerships that the only way you can really make a profit on is cutting corners, literally, because you have a finite tax base that can't really be adjusted. So you either do that out the expense of labor or through embezzlement or whatever, and I've seen all kinds of things. Look up how many charter schools get shut down for basically being scams. And they don't, certain charter schools do way better at certain things, certain kinds of test scores, etc. But most of them don't really show marked more success than public schools, and they do take a lot of decent students out of public schools. And I've worked at both, so I can talk a lot about it. I had a lot more freedom as a charter school teacher, though. That was absolutely true. I wrote a lot more. I mean, I write curriculum now, and I have a fair amount of freedom as a curriculum writer today, but I have a lot more things holding me back in the public school system, and a lot more calls for accountability from both liberals and conservatives. And since conservatives now have taken the liberal notions of liberal notions of protecting children to a logical conclusion where it's now a culture war all the time, we increasingly just can't teach things. But we do have to reset up universal education, I think. It can be done with the system as it exists, or you can burn it all down and start over. I suspect if you burn it all down and start over, the poor are going to get really, really fucked, though. And Adubato didn't really talk about that. Also, private schools tend to pay less than public schools, so that's the problem. And certain public schools actually pay well for the region, certain ones don't. School teachers don't do well in terms of people who have graduate degrees, but they do well in terms of general society, because general society is a lot poorer than people tend to realize. But anyway, those are all the caveats. I don't know that this article really offers a solution, and I think it's over-reliant on Lash. And as a person who's really read a lot of Lash and agrees with Lash's hatred of John Dewey and Horace Mann, for example, I think we're going to have to really think about what we're doing, period, because there's no society on earth that's engaged in capitalism that's able to provide that much leisure time that both parties, that you have a family wage from one household earner, for example, anymore. And on that note, protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment if you want to leave a comment, and start taking education seriously.